Hey guys, tonight we step quietly into medieval Europe. A world where rumours spread faster than plague, your neighbours judged you constantly, and people treated suspicion like a competitive hobby. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand in the middle of the village square, trying very hard not to panic, while a priest blesses a glowing piece of iron beside you. This is already going worse than your morning usually does. The crowd surrounding you smells faintly of smoke, wet wool, stale ale, and animals that absolutely should not be standing this close to legal proceedings. Somewhere nearby, a goat screams like it also disagrees with the justice system. A baby cries. An old woman mutters prayers while openly staring at you with the excitement of someone attending medieval reality television. And directly in front of you sits the iron, orange-red, hissing softly in the cold air. According to the local court, this is how truth is discovered. You have been accused of stealing a silver cup from a merchant. There is no evidence, of course. Medieval Europe rarely concerns itself with evidence when panic, gossip, and public suspicion are available completely free of charge. But the priest explains the ordeal calmly. God knows whether you are guilty. God controls fire. Therefore, if you are innocent, God will protect your hand. If you are guilty, your burns will heal badly. Which honestly feels less like justice and more like an extremely dangerous cooking experiment supervised by theology majors. The villagers nod seriously as though this explanation clears everything up. You glance around the square hoping somebody might object to the obvious flaws here. But everyone appears completely comfortable with the idea that the creator of the universe is about to personally involve himself in a dispute over tableware. The priest finishes his Latin prayers. You step forward. The iron is placed into your hands. Pain instantly shoots through your body so violently that for one beautiful moment, you briefly forget your own name, your family history, and possibly several commandments. Every instinct inside you screams to throw the iron directly into the nearest pond. But you cannot. Dropping it looks guilty. Everything looks guilty in medieval Europe. Sweating too much looks guilty. Stuttering looks guilty. Looking nervous while holding burning metal somehow also looks guilty. At this point, blinking suspiciously could probably lead to another trial entirely. You stagger forward carrying the iron the required number of steps, while villagers watch in complete silence. Somewhere in the crowd, a man named Thomas is definitely whispering, "See? I told you he looked dishonest." Thomas has hated you since the chicken incident 3 years ago. Finally, the priest wraps your burned hand in cloth. Now comes the waiting. In several days, officials will inspect the wound. If it heals cleanly, you are innocent. If it becomes infected, congratulations on your guilt. Unfortunately, medieval medicine is not especially encouraging. Most people rarely bathe. Surgeons often share tools with barbers, and somewhere nearby, a doctor is confidently treating illness by draining blood from someone who merely coughed aggressively near a cabbage. Still, everyone around you genuinely believes this works. The priest looks solemn. The villagers whisper prayers. The local lord watches carefully from his chair while eating roasted meat with his hands. Because in this world, truth is not discovered through investigation. Truth is discovered by seeing whether your hand rots quickly enough. If carrying a burning piece of iron sounded unpleasant, medieval courts had another option prepared for you. Boiling water. Because apparently someone looked at soup preparation and thought, yes, this could also solve criminal investigations. You stand inside a cold stone church, while a large cauldron bubbles over an open fire nearby. Steam fills the room. Priests whisper prayers. Villagers crowd together behind wooden barriers, waiting to see whether God plans to boil your skin off today. The accusation this time is more serious. A local farmer claims you stole coins from his home during a feast. Conveniently, he has no proof whatsoever beyond a suspicious feeling, and the fact that you once argued with him about pigs. This is considered more than enough evidence to proceed directly towards scalding temperatures. The priest explains the ordeal calmly, as if discussing weather. You must place your hand into the boiling water and retrieve a small stone from the bottom of the cauldron. If your wounds heal well afterward, God has declared you innocent. If the burns become infected, blister badly, or fail to heal properly, you are guilty. Again, this system relies heavily on medieval medicine not being medieval medicine. You stare into the boiling water while trying not to imagine your own skin separating from your body like poorly cooked poultry. Around you, villagers murmur nervously. Some make the sign of the cross. Others already look convinced of your guilt simply because you appear terrified, which feels unfair. Most people would look terrified before voluntarily reaching into boiling water. Even innocent people tend to prefer not being turned into stew ingredients. The priest finishes his prayer. You kneel beside the cauldron. The heat alone feels unbearable. Your face stings from the steam. Sweat rolls down your neck despite the freezing weather outside. Somewhere in the back of the church, a child is crying while his mother whispers that God always protects the innocent. Very comforting. You lower your hand slowly toward the water. Then comes the pain, immediate, violent, all-consuming. You desperately search the bottom of the cauldron while every survival instinct inside your body screams that this entire civilization has lost its mind. Finally, your fingers touch the stone. You pull it free and collapse backward, clutching your arm while priests wrap the burns carefully in cloth. Now comes the waiting. Several days later, officials will inspect the wound and decide whether heaven personally approved your performance, which means your fate now depends entirely on infection rates inside a medieval village where people regularly throw chamber pots into the street and consider onions a reasonable medical treatment. If medieval people thought boiling water could reveal truth, they also believed cold water had opinions, strong opinions. You are led to the edge of a freezing river just outside the village at sunrise. Mist hangs low over the water. The air smells damp and bitter. Villagers gather along the muddy banks, whispering excitedly, while trying not to slip directly into the trial themselves. The accusation against you this time is darker. Someone claims you made a pact with evil forces after several cows became sick near your property, which is unfortunate because medieval livestock died constantly. Entire animals could collapse because of disease, poor feeding, bad weather, or simply deciding life on a medieval farm was no longer worth continuing. But reason is not especially popular here today. The priest explains the ordeal while two men tie ropes around your waist. Since water is holy, he says, it will reject guilty people. If you float, you are guilty. If you sink, you are innocent. You stare at him silently for a moment, waiting for the rest of the explanation. There is no rest of the explanation. That is the whole system. So your legal defense now depends entirely on basic buoyancy. The villagers nod seriously as though this sounds perfectly scientific. Somewhere behind you, an old man mutters that water never lies, which is a fascinating statement, considering people drown in it constantly. You glance at the river, dark, freezing, moving quickly, and suddenly you realize the truly impressive part of medieval justice is not the cruelty, it is the confidence. Nobody here seems remotely concerned that this process may contain one or two small flaws. The priest raises a cross. Prayers are spoken, then you are lowered into the water. The cold hits like a hammer. Your entire body locks instantly. You gasp violently while the river soaks through your clothes and drags at your legs. The ropes tighten around your chest as villagers lean forward trying to determine whether God personally approves of your floating position. For several horrifying seconds you hover awkwardly near the surface. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Floating looks suspicious. Sinking looks innocent. Unfortunately, sinking also looks extremely fatal. You kick desperately while icy water floods your ears. Somewhere nearby, a woman whispers that guilty souls are always rejected by holy water. Meanwhile, you are mostly focused on not dying in front of people named things like Ethelred and Bartholomew. Finally, the men yank you back toward shore coughing violently, while priests debate the results. Because in medieval Europe, your innocence is determined not through evidence, witnesses, or rational investigation, but through whether a river finds you personally offensive. You sit inside a crowded church staring nervously at a piece of bread. Not an especially threatening piece of bread. No spikes, no poison, no glowing runes carved into it by mysterious monks. Just dry bread and cheese sitting on a wooden plate. And yet everyone around you is treating it like a loaded weapon. Welcome to the coroned ordeal, one of medieval England's stranger methods for detecting lies. The logic behind it is simple. If you are innocent, God will allow you to swallow the blessed food safely. If you are guilty, your throat will tighten, you will choke, and heaven itself will expose your crime in front of the village. Essentially, medieval courts accidentally invented stress eating as a legal procedure. The priest blesses the bread carefully while you stand before the altar trying not to sweat too visibly. Unfortunately, sweating already makes you look suspicious. Everything does. The accusation this time is theft. A wealthy merchant claims you stole silver coins from his chest during a feast. Conveniently, half the village attended the feast. Everyone was drunk by sunset, and nobody actually saw anything. But you once argued with the merchant over grain prices, which in medieval logic practically makes you the criminal mastermind of the century. The church is silent now. Villagers watch closely, while candles flicker against the stone walls. Somewhere in the back, someone coughs dramatically, like they already expect your public choking to begin shortly. The priest hands you the bread. It feels impossibly dry. You try to swallow calmly, but the pressure is overwhelming. Every eye in the church remains fixed on your throat. Even the merchant is leaning forward with the excitement of a man attending live entertainment. You take the first bite. Immediately your mouth turns dry as dust. Your heart pounds. Your tongue sticks awkwardly to the roof of your mouth. You chew carefully, while trying not to imagine yourself choking to death over what is essentially medieval communion anxiety. A small cough escapes your throat. The villagers gasp softly. Wonderful. Now you are coughing in a silent church while holding cursed cheese under the direct supervision of God. You force yourself to swallow, painfully, slowly. The bread finally slides down your throat while the priest studies your face with terrifying seriousness. For several long seconds nobody speaks. Then whispers ripple through the crowd. Some think you passed. Others think the cough looked suspicious. Because in medieval Europe, even eating lunch could accidentally become a criminal investigation. Sometimes medieval courts looked at complicated legal disputes and decided the best solution was simple. Let the two angry men hit each other with weapons until God sorted it out. This was called trial by combat, and somehow it remained an accepted legal practice for centuries. You stand now in an open field outside the town, surrounded by shouting villagers. Mud sticks to your boots. Rain drizzles lightly from grey skies. Across from you stands the man accusing you of lying. A broad-shouldered farmer named Oswin, who looks less like a legal participant and more like someone who wrestles oxen recreationally. You, meanwhile, have not slept properly in 3 days. The accusation involves land boundaries. Oswin claims you moved the markers between your farms during the night. You insist you did not. Modern courts might examine documents. Medieval courts hand both of you shields. A priest steps between you and raises a cross toward the crowd. God will grant victory to the truthful man, he announces solemnly. The villagers nod seriously, because apparently the creator of the universe now spends his afternoons refereeing property disputes in muddy fields. You grip your weapon nervously while Oswin cracks his neck with deeply concerning confidence. Somewhere nearby, a blacksmith is already taking bets. The rules are simple enough. Fight until one man surrenders, collapses, or dies. Entirely normal legal procedure. Trumpets sound. Oswin charges immediately. You barely block the first strike before stumbling backward through the mud. The crowd erupts with excitement. Someone yells that your defense looks guilty, which feels unfair considering you are mostly focused on not getting your skull separated from your body. The fight drags on brutally. Your arms ache. Your lungs burn. Mud splashes into your face every time you fall. Oswin swings like a man personally chosen by divine forces to end arguments with violence. At one point, you briefly wonder whether confessing to crimes you did not commit might actually be simpler than continuing this process. Meanwhile, the priest watches calmly from the sidelines as if two exhausted peasants beating each other senseless is a perfectly reasonable path towards spiritual truth. Finally, after another vicious exchange, Oswin slips in the mud and crashes heavily onto his back. The crowd gasps. You stand over him, breathing hard while he struggles to rise. Moments later, officials declare you victorious, which means you are now officially innocent because another man lost his footing near a puddle. And honestly, for medieval justice, that counts as one of the more scientific outcomes. You kneel inside a candlelit church while a priest carefully unwraps what appears to be a human fingerbone from a velvet cloth. Everyone around you treats this moment with enormous seriousness. You're trying very hard not to stare directly at the finger. In medieval Europe, one of the most feared ways to test honesty involved swearing an oath upon holy relics, bones, teeth, clothing, or possessions believed to belong to saints. People genuinely believed that lying while touching these sacred objects could bring divine punishment upon you almost immediately. Blindness, disease, madness, sudden death. The full medieval customer service package. The accusation today is fraud. A local merchant claims you cheated him during a grain transaction. He insists the sacks you sold were partially filled with spoiled wheat, hidden beneath the good grain. You insist this is nonsense, mostly because it was actually your cousin's idea. But now you sit inside a freezing church, while a priest slowly presents what may or may not be the thumb bone of St. Cuthbert. Medieval relic authentication was not especially rigorous. Entire churches somehow possessed enough saint bones to assemble several extra saints. Still, nobody here doubts their power. The villagers stare at you nervously. Some make the sign of the cross. Others avoid even looking at the relic directly, as though eye contact alone could accidentally invite divine judgment. The priest speaks quietly. Place your hand upon the relic and swear before God that you speak truthfully. Simple enough in theory. Except medieval people truly believed God punished false oaths. Not metaphorically. Literally, a liar might collapse dead tomorrow, lose his crops, develop some horrifying illness, or spend eternity burning in hell because of one dishonest sentence about wheat quality, which suddenly makes modern tax audits seem strangely relaxing. Your hand trembles slightly as you touch the relic. The church falls silent. Even the merchant looks uncomfortable now. It is one thing to accuse someone publicly. It is another thing entirely to involve supernatural consequences and possible saint-related curses. You swallow hard and speak the oath aloud. For several long seconds nothing happens. No thunder. No heavenly fire. No dramatic collapse onto the church floor. But that almost makes things worse, because now everyone waits nervously to see whether God plans to punish you later instead. Medieval justice often operated on delayed suspense. As you leave the church, villagers whisper quietly behind you while glancing at the sky, because in this world, truth is not proven through evidence or investigation. Truth is proven by seeing whether a dead saint decides to ruin your life afterward. You stand barefoot at the edge of the church courtyard, staring at several glowing metal plowshares laid across the ground. This is apparently another completely reasonable way to determine whether you are lying. The iron burns bright orange in the early morning darkness while priests chant nearby. Smoke rises into the cold air. Villagers crowd around the courtyard walls, whispering nervously and pretending they are not enjoying this far too much. You have been accused of breaking into a nobleman's storage barn and stealing food during the winter famine. To be fair, everyone has been stealing food during the winter famine, but unfortunately for you, someone actually noticed. The priest explains the ordeal carefully. You must walk barefoot across the burning plowshares without hesitation. Afterwards, your feet will be wrapped and examined days later. If the wounds heal properly, God has declared you innocent. If not, congratulations on your criminality and partial foot destruction. You glance down at the glowing metal. At no point in human evolution did your ancestors prepare you emotionally for this moment. The villagers murmur prayers while the nobleman watches from a wooden chair wrapped in expensive fur. Conveniently, he is not the one about to step barefoot onto farm equipment heated to the temperature of volcanic rage. The priest raises a cross. You remove your shoes slowly. The ground itself already feels freezing beneath your feet. The contrast somehow makes the burning iron ahead look even worse, like the gates of hell designed by agricultural workers. Then comes the order. Walk. You step forward. The first touch of metal sends pain exploding through your entire body instantly. Your muscles tighten violently. Every instinct screams at you to leap sideways into the mud and flee directly into another country. But you keep moving, one step, then another. The smell reaches you almost immediately. Burning skin. A deeply unpleasant reminder that medieval justice often sounds suspiciously similar to cooking instructions. The villagers stare in complete silence while you stumble across the final plowshare and collapse onto the cold ground, gasping. Priests rush forward, wrapping your feet carefully in cloth, while nearby spectators debate whether your screams sounded innocent or guilty. Because apparently there are now correct and incorrect ways to scream while being roasted alive from the ankles down. Several days later, officials will inspect your wounds, and in a civilization where infection spreads faster than gossip at a monastery, Your future now depends entirely on whether your feet decay at an acceptable rate. You stand inside the town hall while two men adjust a giant weighing scale normally used for sacks of grain. Today, however, the grain has been replaced with you, because medieval Europe occasionally looked at ordinary farming equipment and thought, "Excellent, this could also become supernatural law enforcement." The accusation against you is witchcraft, not dramatic movie-style witchcraft involving lightning or floating castles. No, your crime is far more medieval. Several neighbours claim your presence caused their butter to spoil and their chickens to stop laying eggs, which feels like an enormous amount of responsibility for one person. Still, rumours spread quickly in small villages, especially during hard winters when people desperately wanted explanations for disease, bad harvests, or why their cow suddenly walked into a ditch and died. And once enough people suspect you of unnatural behaviour, things become dangerous very quickly. The local officials believe the scale can reveal hidden evil. You are ordered to stand upon one side while weights are placed on the other. Some communities believed witches and liars weighed unnaturally little because evil forces made them lighter. Others believed guilt itself somehow altered the body. The science here is admittedly difficult to follow. Even the villagers seem slightly confused, though none of them want to admit it publicly. Medieval people respected confidence above almost everything else. If a priest announced that honesty could be measured through onions, half the village would probably begin distrusting vegetables by sunset. You climb carefully onto the wooden platform. The scale creaks loudly beneath your weight. Villagers lean forward nervously. A woman near the front clutches a cross while staring at you as though you may begin levitating at any moment. Honestly, after everything else medieval courts have tried, levitation would almost feel refreshingly efficient. Weights are added slowly. The scale shifts. Murmurs spread through the room. Some people whisper that you look too calm, which apparently is suspicious. Others whisper that you look too nervous, which is also suspicious. Medieval accusations worked much like weather forecasts. Vague, contradictory, and somehow always blamed on you eventually. Finally, the balance settles. The officials debate quietly among themselves while the crowd watches in silence. Your entire fate now depends on the interpretation of a grain scale operated by men who think spoiled butter may be connected to dark supernatural forces. And the truly remarkable part is that everyone here believes this process is perfectly rational, because in medieval Europe, truth was not discovered through logic or evidence. Truth was discovered through vibes, prayer, and agricultural equipment. You stand before the village court, surrounded not by weapons, boiling water, or glowing iron, which already feels like progress, but by people. Unfortunately, this may actually be worse. Today's test is called compurgation, though most villagers simply think of it as finding enough people willing to publicly swear you are not terrible. The accusation against you is fraud. A local trader claims you sold him weak ale diluted with water during the autumn market, which is ironic because everyone in town dilutes ale with water. Medieval ale sometimes tasted like wet bread left inside a barrel beside a horse. But apparently your version crossed a spiritual line. The judge explains the ordeal. You must gather oath helpers, respectable people from the community willing to swear before God that they believe you are innocent. They do not need evidence. They do not need facts. They simply need confidence in your character, which immediately becomes a problem if you have spent the last 10 years arguing with half the village over fences, pigs, or whose goat ate whose cabbage. You glance nervously at the crowd. Some villagers avoid eye contact instantly. Cowards. Others stare at you with the expression of people calculating whether publicly supporting you is worth possible divine punishment. Because lying under oath is dangerous enough. Lying under oath in medieval Europe is essentially volunteering for future lightning strikes. Finally, a few people step forward. Your cousin Edwin, mostly because he owes you money. An elderly farmer who once traded sheep with your father. And surprisingly, the blacksmith, though he still looks deeply uncertain about the entire decision. The priest watches carefully while each person swears before God that they believe your words are truthful. The villagers murmur quietly after every oath. Too few supporters look suspicious. Too many supporters also look suspicious. At this point, breathing confidently might accidentally become evidence. One man refuses to support you publicly after his wife whispers sharply into his ear, Another claims he would help, but suddenly remembers important turnip business elsewhere. Traitor. The court counts the oaths carefully. You need enough respected voices to convince the officials that a guilty person could never gather such support, which means medieval justice has quietly transformed into a popularity contest, sponsored by religion and social anxiety. Finally, the judge nods slowly. The oaths are accepted. You are declared innocent, not because evidence proved anything, not because the truth became clear, but because enough people in town disliked you slightly less than eternal damnation. You sit alone inside a dark church, while a single candle burns on the table in front of you, which would feel peaceful in almost any other century. Unfortunately, in medieval Europe, even candlelight can accuse you of crimes. The room smells of wax, smoke, and damp stone. Rain taps softly against the windows, while several priests watch you with expressions so serious you would think the fate of Christendom depended entirely on your posture. The accusation this time is arson. A storage shed burned down near the edge of the village 2 nights ago, and since you argued publicly with the owner last month, suspicion has settled onto you like wet wool. There is no evidence naturally, just gossip. Medieval society runs almost entirely on gossip. The priest explains the ordeal quietly. You must answer questions while sitting before the blessed candle. If the flame flickers violently, sputters strangely, or extinguishes itself during your testimony, it may reveal divine disapproval. You stare at the candle for several seconds. That is apparently the entire method. To be fair, medieval people lived in a world where almost everything felt supernatural. Storms destroyed crops. Disease appeared without warning. Entire families vanished during winters. When life constantly feels mysterious and terrifying, even candle flames begin looking suspiciously judgmental. The questioning begins. Did you threaten the owner of the shed? You answer carefully. The candle flickers slightly. Several villagers gasp. Wonderful. A cold draft slips beneath the church door, but nobody seems interested in blaming the wind. Superstition is far more exciting. The priest narrows his eyes. Were you near the shed on the night of the fire? You hesitate for half a second, trying to remember. The candle trembles again. Now the crowd is whispering openly. At this point, the flame could probably explode because of basic air circulation, and someone would immediately accuse you of summoning demons. Sweat rolls down your neck while you continue answering questions. The room feels unbearably silent except for the crackling candle and occasional thunder outside. Then suddenly the flame bends sharply sideways. A woman near the back mutters a prayer. Another villager makes the sign of the cross. Meanwhile, you are sitting there realizing your legal future now depends entirely on medieval indoor ventilation. Finally, after what feels like hours, the questioning ends. The priests debate quietly while the candle burns calmly again, having apparently completed its dramatic performance. Because in medieval Europe, truth was not uncovered through investigation or logic. Truth was discovered by aggressively overanalyzing household lighting. You stand inside the monastery courtyard with your arms stretched outward like a cross, while a priest watches you with the intensity of a man supervising the fate of civilization itself. Across from you stands your accuser doing the exact same thing. The rules are simple. Whoever lowers their arms first loses the case. This, somehow, is an officially recognized legal procedure. The accusation involves slander. A neighbouring merchant claims you spread lies about his business after several customers stopped buying his cloth. You insist you merely mentioned that his fabric smelled strange and fell apart in the rain, which, to be fair, is not exactly glowing praise. Still, the court has decided the matter can best be solved through what looks remarkably similar to a deeply uncomfortable exercise class. The priest explains the logic behind the ordeal. Christ suffered upon the cross. Therefore God will grant strength to the innocent person and allow them to endure longer. A fascinating legal theory, especially considering shoulder muscles are not usually associated with moral purity. The villagers gather around the courtyard whispering excitedly. Some place bets quietly. Others stare at you with the grim fascination of people attending medieval entertainment, disguised as spirituality. You raise your arms fully. At first it seems manageable. Unpleasant certainly, but manageable. Then the minutes begin passing. Your shoulders tighten. Your elbows ache. A cold wind pushes through the courtyard while your muscles slowly transform into burning agony. Across from you, the merchant already looks miserable, though unfortunately so do you. The priest continues praying calmly. while both of you tremble like exhausted scarecrows. Somewhere nearby, a monk coughs loudly. Another appears completely asleep against the wall, which honestly feels like the healthiest response to this entire event. 10 more minutes pass. Pain now shoots through your arms constantly. Your fingers twitch uncontrollably. Sweat drips down your forehead despite the cold weather. The merchant groans. The villagers murmur excitedly. One woman whispers that your shaking looks guilty, which is deeply unfair considering your shoulders are currently experiencing spiritual collapse. You try focusing on breathing, on surviving, on not accidentally becoming the first person in history to lose a legal dispute because of arm cramps. Then suddenly the merchant's right arm drops. The crowd erupts instantly. The priest raises his hands dramatically, while officials declare divine judgment has been revealed. You are innocent. Not because evidence cleared your name, not because witnesses proved anything, but because another man became tired slightly faster than you did, which means medieval justice has now fully evolved into competitive suffering. You sit across from a priest inside a tiny candlelit chamber, while he asks you an extremely unsettling question. What have you been dreaming about? You blink at him in confusion, because you expected accusations, perhaps torture, maybe another aggressively religious interaction with fire. But apparently, medieval justice has now entered your subconscious. The accusation against you is theft. A wealthy widow claims her jewelry disappeared shortly after you visited her estate. No witnesses exist. No evidence has been found. But unfortunately for you, she also claims you looked uneasy. In medieval Europe, appearing uneasy after being accused of theft was practically a confession. The priest leans closer. Have you suffered nightmares lately? You hesitate. This is dangerous territory. Many medieval people believed guilt revealed itself through troubled sleep. Nightmares, restless behavior, strange visions, sleep-talking or fearful dreams were sometimes viewed as signs that God, or perhaps darker forces, were tormenting a guilty conscience, which means your sleeping habits have somehow become part of a criminal investigation. You explain carefully that you slept poorly last night. A mistake. The priest immediately narrows his eyes. Poorly how? You attempt to describe the dream vaguely. Something about wolves near the forest and falling into cold water. The priest crosses himself. Excellent. Now the wolves are spiritually involved. Outside the chamber, villagers whisper nervously while waiting for updates. Medieval communities loved dream interpretation because dreams felt mysterious and frightening already. Most people slept in cold rooms beside family members, animals, insects, and occasionally chickens with deeply concerning nighttime opinions. Everyone had nightmares constantly. Disease killed children overnight. Wars erupted suddenly. Winters destroyed harvests. Even perfectly innocent people probably dreamed about doom every other evening. But medieval logic rarely allowed fear to remain ordinary. Fear had to mean something. The questioning continues. Did the wolves speak? Did the water feel cursed? Did you see flames? At this point, your legal defense has transformed into explaining random sleep hallucinations to a man who believes symbolic dreams may contain divine criminal evidence. You begin sweating. The priest notices immediately. More notes are written down. Wonderful. Now, nervousness during dream analysis also looks suspicious. Finally, after nearly an hour, the questioning ends. The priest dismisses you quietly, while murmuring that guilty souls often betray themselves during sleep. You leave the chamber exhausted, because in medieval Europe, even unconsciousness was apparently not private anymore. And somewhere tonight, while trying desperately to sleep peacefully, you will probably have another nightmare, which unfortunately will also look guilty. You stand in the middle of the village square while everyone watches a dog. Not a trained hunting dog. Not some majestic royal hound. Just a nervous farm dog named Hugo currently scratching himself beside a barrel. And somehow your entire reputation now depends on his opinion. The accusation against you is witchcraft again, because medieval Europe truly never got tired of that category. A farmer claims his horses became agitated whenever you walked past his stable. Another insists his chickens stopped laying eggs after you argued with him during market day. Honestly, the chickens probably just hated him personally. But fear spreads quickly in small villages, especially when crops fail or animals behave strangely. Medieval people spent most of their lives surrounded by livestock. So unusual animal behavior felt deeply important to them. Animals supposedly sensed evil, lies, curses, or hidden corruption long before humans could. Which sounds mystical until you remember that horses are frightened by wind and chickens regularly panic because of absolutely nothing. The village priest steps forward solemnly. If the animals react badly to you, he explains, it may reveal hidden guilt within your soul. You glance at the dog. The dog glances back. Neither of you seems fully prepared for this responsibility. The crowd waits silently, while you walk slowly across the square toward the animals tied nearby. A horse snorts loudly and jerks its head. Several villagers gasp immediately. Wonderful. You are now being judged by what is essentially a large nervous grass enthusiast. The priest whispers prayers while the farmer points dramatically toward the stable, as though Satan himself just emerged from behind the hay bales. You continue walking. The dog suddenly begins barking wildly. The crowd erupts into terrified murmuring. Meanwhile, you notice the dog is actually barking at a goose behind you, but medieval panic has already moved too fast for logic to catch up. A woman pulls her child closer. Someone mutters that animals always know. Another villager claims the horse looked directly into your eyes with fear. To be fair, the horse also looked terrified of a wooden bucket 5 minutes earlier. The priest orders you to approach the stable again. You do. This time one of the chickens flaps violently and crashes into a fence. At this point, you are one nervous goat away from execution. The officials discuss the reaction seriously, while villagers stare at you with growing suspicion. Because in medieval Europe, truth was not determined through evidence or reason. Truth was determined by livestock behaving slightly weird near you on a stressful afternoon. You stand before the church altar holding a heavy Bible while the priest watches you like a hawk searching for signs of spiritual collapse. The church is silent except for the crackling candles and your own breathing, which unfortunately already sounds guilty. Today's accusation is heresy, a dangerous word in medieval Europe. Heresy did not simply mean people disagreed with you, it meant your beliefs might threaten the soul of the entire community, which is an enormous amount of pressure for someone who mostly made the mistake of arguing with a monk about whether a certain saint actually performed miracles involving cabbage. You should have let the cabbage miracle go. Now you stand before half the village, while church officials prepare to test your honesty through sacred reading. The logic is simple enough. A truthful and innocent person, protected by God, should be able to read Holy Scripture calmly and clearly. A liar or sinner, however, may stumble, sweat, hesitate, or struggle beneath divine pressure, which is unfortunate, because public reading is already terrifying even without eternal damnation attached to it. The priest opens the Bible slowly. You stare down at the Latin text. Another problem immediately appears. You barely read Latin, like most ordinary medieval people. Your education mostly involves surviving winter and not dying from infected splinters. But the court does not seem especially interested in literacy statistics today. The priest orders you to begin. You start reading carefully, stumbling through the unfamiliar words while the villagers watch in complete silence. Sweat forms on your forehead almost instantly. A few phrases come out awkwardly. Someone in the crowd whispers, "Wonderful." Now pronunciation has become spiritually suspicious. You continue reading while your hands shake slightly. The candles flicker against the stone walls. Somewhere behind you, an old woman quietly mutters prayers as though expecting demons to emerge directly from the grammar mistakes. Then you mispronounce a sentence badly. The priest looks up sharply. Several villagers gasp. At this point, you are one misplaced syllable away from accidental exorcism. You try correcting yourself, but nervousness only makes everything worse. Your voice cracks. The pages tremble in your hands. The silence inside the church becomes unbearable. And the truly frustrating part is that even an innocent person would struggle under this pressure, especially while being judged by people named things like Godric and Mildred, who cannot read at all but somehow still look disappointed in your performance. Finally, the priest takes back the Bible. The villagers whisper nervously while officials discuss whether your reading sounded truthful enough. Because in medieval Europe, guilt could apparently be detected through stress, bad pronunciation, and public embarrassment. You sit alone inside a cold stone chamber, staring at the table in front of you, while two priests and a local official wait patiently for you to confess. No glowing iron this time, no boiling water, no barking dogs or nervous chickens, just silence. And honestly, somehow this feels worse. The accusation against you has grown larger over the past weeks. What began as suspicion over stolen goods has slowly transformed into rumours of deception, blasphemy, and possible dealings with dark forces. Medieval accusations had a tendency to expand the way mould spreads across forgotten bread. Quietly, aggressively. You look exhausted because you are exhausted. For days you have endured ordeals, questioning, public suspicion, religious ceremonies, and the crushing pressure of knowing that almost anything you say, do, or dream about can suddenly become evidence. You understand the real purpose now. The trials were never only about discovering truth. They were about breaking you. The priest folds his hands calmly.
"Confess," he says softly.
God already knows. That sentence hangs heavily in the room, because medieval people truly believed hidden sins poisoned the soul. Confession was not merely legal surrender, it was spiritual survival. To confess meant possible mercy. To continue denying guilt meant risking punishment in both this world and the next. Outside the chamber, rain taps against the monastery walls. Somewhere distant, church bells echo across the village. You realize everyone already expects a confession eventually. The villagers, the priests, the officials, even your neighbours. After all, innocent people do not survive this much suspicion without eventually looking guilty. Weeks of fear and exhaustion wear down anyone. You have barely slept. Your hands still ache from earlier ordeals. Every conversation feels dangerous. At some point, even innocence begins sounding unconvincing. The official leans forward. "If you confess now," he says, "the court may show mercy." May, a wonderfully medieval word. You stare at the candle burning on the table between you all. Its flame moves slightly in the draught while shadows crawl along the stone walls. And suddenly you understand why so many people confess to crimes they never committed. Not because the ordeals proved anything, not because truth became clear, but because endless fear eventually crushes the mind itself. The silence stretches. The priests wait. The rain continues outside. And somewhere deep inside, you begin wondering whether confessing might finally allow this nightmare to end. Which, in the end, was often the real medieval lie detector. The plague had arrived long before you understood what it truly meant. At first it was only whispers drifting down trade roads from distant towns, sailors dying in ports, entire households nailed shut, priests speaking in quieter voices than usual, which was never a promising sign. Medieval priests normally sounded very confident about everything, especially suffering. Then one morning the baker did not open his shutters. 2 days later neither did the blacksmith. By the end of the month the village smelled faintly of smoke, wet straw, sickness, and fear. A combination no medieval perfume merchant ever dared to bottle. Though honestly, it would have been more accurate than most of their products. And yet somehow, despite the world collapsing around you, the cows still needed milking. That was the strange part about the Black Death. Death itself moved unpredictably, but dairy work remained aggressively consistent. A cow did not care that half the village had died this season. It did not pause to reflect on mortality or God's judgment. It simply stared at you with dull annoyance until you sat down with the bucket. So every morning before sunrise, you walked through muddy lanes toward the small dairy shed beside your family cottage. The village was quieter now. Too quiet. Fewer voices drifted from windows. Fewer fires burned in hearths. Sometimes you passed homes with doors hanging open and nobody willing to enter. Other times you saw chalk crosses painted onto wood by frightened neighbours hoping God appreciated basic geometry. Inside the shed, however, life continued with insulting normality. The goats shuffled impatiently. The cows snorted steam into the cold dawn air. Flies buzzed lazily around old straw. Your mother worked silently beside you, wrapping cloth around her face whenever somebody coughed nearby. Though nobody truly understood how the disease spread, some blamed bad air. Others blamed foreigners, planets, sinners, cats, or women who knew too much about herbs. Medieval medicine was essentially a giant group project created by panic. Still, milk flowed into the buckets. And milk meant cheese. Cheese mattered now more than ever because fresh food spoiled quickly. Markets failed constantly, and grain shipments disappeared without warning. But cheese could survive. Hard wheels of cheese sat in storage rooms like edible insurance policies. Villages traded them carefully. Families guarded them fiercely. A good cheese wheel during the plague could make you richer than common sense. Besides, cheese was one of the few things still holding the village together. People no longer trusted crowds, priests, or even neighbours. But they still trusted the old woman who sold goat cheese near the well, which during the Black Death honestly counted as social stability. By autumn, the village market no longer sounded like a market. It sounded like survivors pretending. You arrived before sunrise with 2 small cheese wheels strapped to a handcart your father once used for firewood. One wheel was goat cheese, hard and salty. The other was softer cow cheese wrapped carefully in cloth to keep the flies away. Not that flies respected cloth very much. Flies during the plague seemed unusually confident. Entire civilizations were collapsing, and somehow the insects behaved like landlords. The road into town felt emptier than it had a year ago. Farms stood abandoned behind crooked fences. Some fields had gone yellow from neglect because there simply were not enough hands left to harvest them. Others had been taken over by wandering sheep, who now enjoyed more property rights than most peasants. And yet the market still opened, because people still needed food. The square itself looked tired. Fewer stalls stood beneath the wooden awnings now. The fish seller was gone. So was the wine merchant. A cloth trader sat alone beside folded fabric no one could afford anymore. Even the thieves seemed less enthusiastic these days. Hard to maintain morale in the robbery profession when half your customers are already dead. But the cheese sellers remained. Always the cheese sellers. Your mother once explained why. Meat spoiled quickly. Bread depended too heavily on grain deliveries. But cheese lasted. Properly aged wheels could survive weeks or months if stored carefully. During uncertain times, people trusted food that did not immediately rot into a science experiment. So villagers still gathered cautiously around dairy stalls, though nobody stood too close anymore. Everyone watched everyone else. A cough could empty half the square within seconds. You noticed strange habits forming among the people. Buyers held herbs against their noses to clean the air. Some carried tiny crosses made of wood or iron. Others avoided touching coins directly, dropping them onto tables as if money itself had become cursed, which, to be fair, medieval taxes had already strongly suggested. An old monk approached your stall near midday. He studied the cheese carefully before speaking. "Still making this during all this?" he asked quietly. You looked around the market square, at the tired faces, the nervous eyes, the carts carrying bodies toward burial pits outside town. Then you shrugged. "The cows did not stop," you answered. The monk actually laughed at that. A short, exhausted laugh from a man who probably had not laughed in months. And for a brief moment, standing there beside 2 wheels of cheese while plague smoke drifted across the rooftops, the world almost felt normal again. Almost. The church bells rang so often now that nobody counted anymore. At first, each bell had meaning. 1 death, then 3, then entire households. Eventually, the ringing became part of the village atmosphere, like rain or barking dogs. You could be halfway through turning a cheese wheel and suddenly hear another slow bell rolling across the hills. Someone else gone. You no longer asked who. Instead, you focused on the cheese cellar beneath your uncle's barn. The cellar had become one of the most important places in the village. Not because it was beautiful. It smelled strongly of damp stone, mould, sour milk and old straw. But down there, hidden beneath the earth, rows of aging cheese rested quietly on wooden shelves, while the world above descended into terror. Hard cheeses matured in darkness while humanity emotionally unravelled upstairs. A strangely efficient arrangement. You carried fresh wheels into the cellar every few days with your cousin Thomas. He spoke less lately. Everyone did. Conversations had become shorter during the plague. People no longer wasted energy discussing dreams or politics when there was a decent chance one of you would be buried by Thursday. Still, Thomas cared deeply about the cheese. "Turn them carefully," he muttered while inspecting a shelf. "The moisture's wrong on this side." You obeyed immediately because nobody argued with the person guarding the winter food supply. Medieval villages did not need economists to explain priorities. The cheese man automatically became important. Candles flickered against the stone walls as you worked. Some wheels were coated in wax. Others were rubbed with salt or herbs to preserve them longer. Every family had small tricks passed down across generations. Tiny dairy secrets treated with greater protection than royal treasure, because treasure could not feed you in January. Meanwhile, above ground, the village continued shrinking. One afternoon you emerged from the cellar and saw smoke rising near the edge of town. Another cottage being burned after the occupants died. People feared the sickness clung to blankets, walls, clothing, even spoons. Entire homes vanished into ash, while nervous villagers crossed themselves from a distance. But that evening, despite everything, families still gathered around tables. And they still ate cheese. Soft cheese with onions, hard cheese with dark bread, goat cheese crumbled into stew, children chewing tiny scraps while adults pretended not to notice how little food remained for winter. The plague had taken neighbours, priests, workers and friends, but somehow dairy traditions survived. Maybe because they had to, or maybe because when the world starts collapsing around you, people cling desperately to ordinary things. A warm fire, a familiar smell. The taste of salted cheese made exactly the same way your grandfather remembered before any plague ships ever touched Europe. Civilization, it turned out, was sometimes held together by very small rituals, and occasionally by suspiciously hard cheese. By winter, nearly everyone in the village knew the widow Agnes would survive. Not because she was strong, not because she was lucky, but because she owned 6 cows. In plague years, this counted as an excellent survival strategy. Her husband had died during the first wave of sickness in spring, buried quickly beside the chapel with half the village watching from a suspicious distance. No touching, no comforting embrace. Just tired faces and cold wind while the priest hurried through prayers like a man trying to outrun God himself. But Agnes stayed, and every morning before dawn, smoke still rose from her dairy shed. You visited her farm with your mother after the first heavy snowfall. The roads were quieter now, buried beneath frozen mud and dirty ice. Even the crows seemed exhausted. A thin layer of frost covered abandoned carts near the edge of town, where owners had either died or wisely decided they no longer wished to participate in medieval civilization. Agnes greeted you holding a wooden bucket under one arm. "You're late," she said. Not hello. Not good morning. Just immediate disappointment. A true dairy farmer. Inside the shed, warmth hit your face instantly. The cows shifted lazily in their stalls while steam rose from their bodies into the cold air. Agnes worked with calm precision, milking without wasted movement. Outside, Europe was experiencing one of the greatest disasters in human history. Inside, dairy production continued like an angry sacred ritual. She had become important to the village now. Widows usually occupied a fragile place in medieval society, but plague years changed old rules quickly. Agnes controlled milk, butter and cheese. That made her valuable enough that even local officials suddenly treated her with respect. Funny how fast society discovers progressive ideas when starvation enters the conversation. While your mother inspected the cheese shelves, Agnes handed you a fresh piece wrapped in cloth. "Eat," she ordered. The cheese was sharp, salty, and richer than most food you had tasted in months. Real winter cheese, made from cows fed carefully through autumn before the cold settled over the land. "You still trade at the market?" you asked. "When it opens." "And if it stops?" Agnes shrugged. "Then people come here. Simple as that. Because no matter how frightened people became, they still needed food. They still carried eggs, firewood, candles or scraps of cloth to exchange for cheese. Plague or no plague, the old systems adapted. Trade became smaller, quieter, more desperate. But it survived. As you prepared to leave, church bells echoed faintly across the snowy fields again. Another burial. Agnes listened for a moment before returning to her work. "The dead keep leaving," she muttered, reaching for another bucket. Then she glanced toward the cows. But these idiots still need milking. Even during the Black Death, somebody still wanted taxes. This was perhaps the most impressive achievement of medieval governments. Half the countryside was dead. Trade routes had collapsed. Priests were dying faster than they could replace them. Entire villages vanished from maps. Yet somehow, like immortal parasites blessed directly by administrative demons, tax collectors continued appearing exactly on schedule. One arrived in your village near the end of winter. You saw him entering through the muddy road beside the chapel, riding a tired horse that looked emotionally defeated by Europe. 2 guards followed behind him carrying spears and expressions suggesting they had not enjoyed this assignment very much. Reasonable. Walking into plague villages for money was not a profession filled with long-term career planning. The tax collector wore a dark wool cloak, scented heavily with herbs and vinegar to protect himself from disease. Medieval medicine had become a strange mix of prayer, panic, and soup ingredients. Some people carried flowers, others burned incense. One man in the next village reportedly rubbed onions on his beard for protection. He died anyway, but historians must admire the commitment. The collector gathered surviving villagers near the square and announced new grain and dairy levies from the local lord. Fewer workers meant lower harvests, which apparently meant peasants should pay more. Medieval economics often operated like a practical joke written by Satan. A tired silence followed the announcement. Nobody shouted. Nobody protested. People simply stared at him with hollow eyes, while burial smoke drifted behind the church tower. Finally, old Agnes stepped forward from the crowd. "The grain stores are half empty," she said calmly. "And half the cows are dead." The collector adjusted his gloves nervously. "The Lord still requires payment. Then perhaps the Lord should milk the cows himself." A dangerous sentence. Several villagers lowered their heads immediately. Even the guards shifted awkwardly. But the collector said nothing because, truthfully, everyone knew she was right. Without dairy farmers, villages starved. Cheese had become one of the few stable foods left. Armies could not eat silver coins. Children could not survive on official documents stamped with wax seals. So compromises quietly emerged. Some families paid taxes with cheese wheels instead of coin. Hard cheeses travelled well and lasted months, making them valuable during uncertain times. Your family surrendered 2 aging wheels from the cellar, while your mother muttered curses under her breath, strong enough to concern nearby saints. The collector inspected them carefully before nodding approval. For a brief moment, the fate of your family rested entirely on whether a stranger liked the smell of your cheese. Civilization truly is a magnificent system. That evening, the village gathered around fires, discussing the visit in bitter whispers. Outside, snow melted slowly across empty fields. Inside homes, cheese was sliced carefully thinner than before. Spring returned slowly, like a nervous guest unsure whether the house was still standing. The snow melted into thick mud. Dead grass pushed through frozen earth. Carts began moving again along the roads, though fewer than before. Much fewer. Some carried grain, others carried salt or cloth. A suspicious number carried corpses, and one carried cheese. You first saw the travelling cheesemonger arriving near midday beside the old Roman road. His wagon leaned heavily to one side, pulled by a horse old enough to remember better centuries. Small wheels of cheese hung beneath a patched canvas cover, while tiny bells clinked softly with every bump in the road. The man himself looked thin but cheerful, which during the plague immediately made everyone suspicious. Healthy optimism had become deeply unnatural. Villagers gathered cautiously around his wagon while maintaining the new habit of standing several feet apart. The cheesemonger greeted people loudly, as though enthusiasm alone could defeat disease. "Best mountain cheese in 3 kingdoms," he announced. Someone muttered, "2 of those kingdoms barely exist anymore." Fair point. Still, people approached, because travellers brought news, and salt, and sometimes hope. The cheesemonger traded hard sheep cheese from northern hills, smoked cheeses wrapped in herbs, and soft white rounds packed carefully in straw. Many villagers had not seen such variety in years. Before the plague, markets connected distant regions regularly. Now every unfamiliar cheese felt almost exotic, like some mysterious foreign luxury from lands where people still bathed occasionally. Your mother traded butter and 2 small goat cheeses for a wedge of aged mountain cheese tougher than oak wood. "Good for travel," the merchant explained proudly, while cutting slices with a knife worn nearly smooth. "Lasts forever. You tasted a piece." It felt like chewing on salted medieval furniture. But honestly, after months of turnips and thin stew, nobody complained. As the afternoon continued, villagers crowded closer to hear the merchant's stories. Entire cities emptied by plague, monasteries abandoned, fields left untouched because there were no workers alive to harvest them. In one town, he claimed, wolves wandered directly through the streets at night. Nobody laughed. It sounded believable now. Then the merchant lowered his voice. "But dairy survived better than most places," he said. "People always protect the milk." That sentence lingered with you, because it was true. Blacksmiths vanished. Taverns closed. Lords fled to distant estates. Yet somehow, across villages shattered by plague, People still guarded cows, goats, and cheese sellers with desperate determination. Milk meant survival. Cheese meant winter food, and food meant tomorrow. As evening approached, the cheesemonger climbed back onto his wagon and disappeared down the muddy road toward the next frightened village. The bells beneath his cheeses jingled softly behind him, a strange little sound of civilization still refusing to die. The monastery survived longer than most places. Not comfortably, not peacefully, but it survived. You visited it with your uncle in late spring after hearing the monks were still trading cheese and medicinal herbs beyond the northern hills. The journey took half a day along muddy roads lined with abandoned farms. Empty cottages leaned crooked beside overgrown fields, while broken fences disappeared beneath weeds. Europe itself looked tired now, as though the continent had stopped shaving and given up emotionally. When the monastery finally appeared through the trees, it looked quieter than you remembered. Fewer monks walked the courtyards. Some windows remained shuttered permanently. A burial trench near the garden told the rest of the story. Still, life continued behind the stone walls. Bells rang softly for prayer. Smoke drifted from kitchens. Somewhere inside, somebody was scrubbing pots with the grim determination of a man aware that hygiene had suddenly become fashionable. A young monk led you toward the dairy rooms beneath the monastery kitchens. The smell hit immediately. Warm milk, damp stone, salt, mould, real monastery cheese. Rows of aging wheels rested on wooden shelves under flickering candlelight. Some were rubbed with ash, others coated with herbs or wax. Blue-green veins spread through certain cheeses intentionally, though your uncle stared at them with understandable suspicion. "You eat that mould?" he asked carefully. The monk nodded proudly. "It improves the flavour." Your uncle looked unconvinced. Medieval people accepted many things, but deliberately consuming suspicious cave fungus still required a strong sales pitch. The monks explained how monasteries had become important food centres during the plague. They owned land, livestock, storage cellars, and knowledge passed down through generations. While towns collapsed into panic, monasteries continued preserving recipes, brewing ale, tending gardens, and making cheese almost exactly as they had before the sickness arrived. Routine kept them sane. Prayer helped too, probably. Though judging by survival rates, the cheese may have been doing most of the work. An older monk joined your group carrying a candle lantern. "We lost 20 brothers last winter," he said quietly. Nobody answered. He rested a hand against one aging cheese wheel. But the dairy remained open every day. There was something strangely comforting about that. While plague carts rolled across Europe and families vanished overnight, somewhere monks still turned cheese wheels in cold cellars, exactly on schedule. Civilization reduced to milk management. The old monk cut small samples for everyone before you left. Sharp cheese, rich and earthy from months underground. As you walked back toward the courtyard, evening bells echoed softly across the monastery walls. And beneath the prayers for the dead, beneath all the fear and exhaustion, the scent of aging cheese still drifted through the stone halls. By summer, people had stopped pretending the plague would end quickly. The first months had been filled with prayers and desperate optimism. Villagers spoke about waiting it out, as though the Black Death were a heavy rainstorm instead of one of the worst disasters in human history. But now the truth settled over Europe like dust. This was life now. Death carts, empty homes, burial pits, and somehow still cheese. You understood this most clearly after the funeral of Tomas's younger sister. She had died suddenly 3 days earlier, feverish and coughing, and by dawn the next morning the church bells were already calling for burial. The service itself was brief, too brief. The priest rushed through prayers while villagers stood apart from one another in uneasy silence. Nobody touched. Nobody embraced the grieving family. Fear had hollowed out even basic human comfort. Then everyone returned to Thomas's house afterward, because that was what people did. Even during plague years, mourning still required food. The table inside the cottage looked surprisingly full considering the times. Dark bread, onion stew, small dried fish from the river, and at the centre, carefully arranged on wooden boards, several wheels of cheese. Goat cheese rolled in herbs, soft fresh cheese wrapped in cloth, a hard-aged wheel Thomas had hidden in the cellar since winter. People gathered around the table quietly, while candles flickered against smoke-darkened walls. Faces looked thinner now, older, Even children seemed tired in ways children should never look tired. Yet slowly, almost awkwardly, conversation returned. An old farmer complained about his surviving mule. Someone laughed quietly about a priest who accidentally blessed a chicken instead of a child last week. One woman argued that cheese tasted better before the plague, which was probably less a culinary observation and more general emotional exhaustion. Still, the room warmed. Food did that. Especially familiar food. You watched Thomas cut thin slices from the aged wheel with almost ceremonial care. Nobody wasted a crumb. Every piece mattered now. But for a little while, the meal created something close to normal life again. Not happiness exactly, just humanity. Outside, the village remained scarred by sickness. Smoke drifted from distant burn pits near abandoned homes. The cemetery had expanded beyond its old stone wall. Somewhere far across Europe, kings, bishops, and merchants struggled helplessly against the same disaster. But inside that tiny cottage, villagers still passed cheese across a table after a funeral. Because rituals survived, even when empires weakened, even when faith trembled, even when half the world seemed to be rotting around you. And honestly, if medieval Europe had one true superpower, it was the ability to continue eating dairy products during catastrophes that would emotionally destroy modern office workers by lunchtime. By the second winter, the village no longer resembled the place you once knew. Too many homes stood empty now. Doors creaked open in the wind where families had once argued beside warm fires. Fields lay abandoned beneath frost, because there were not enough hands left to work them. Even the dogs barked less often, as though they too understood something terrible had settled permanently over the world. And beneath your uncle's barn, only one large cheese wheel remained in the cellar. The last one. You carried a lantern downstairs carefully while cold air wrapped around the stone walls. The shelves that once held dozens of aging cheeses now stood mostly empty. Some had been traded for grain, others eaten during spring shortages. A few surrendered as taxes to men who somehow survived entirely on paperwork and peasant suffering. But one wheel still rested quietly at the center shelf. Hard. Waxed. Heavy. Your family had protected it for months like treasure, because in many ways it was. The cellar smelled familiar despite everything. Damp earth, salt, old milk. The same scent you remembered before the plague arrived. Strange how certain smells survived disasters untouched. Patiently waiting while humanity lost its mind upstairs. Your mother joined you carrying a knife wrapped in cloth. "We open it tonight," she said softly. "Not celebrate, not feast. Simply open." That evening, the remaining villagers gathered inside your cottage while snow drifted across the dark streets outside. There were fewer people now than ever before, so few that silence appeared constantly between conversations, reminding everyone who was missing. Still, candles burned warmly across the table. The last cheese wheel sat in the center beside rough bread and weak ale. Your mother cut into it slowly. The inside was pale gold, perfectly aged despite the terrible year surrounding it. The smell filled the room immediately, sharp, rich, alive. For a moment nobody spoke. The simple scent alone seemed to pull memories from people's minds. Summers before the plague, markets crowded with noise, children running through fields, weddings, harvest festivals, ordinary life. Thomas accepted the first piece quietly. The heels were bright red, not tasteful red, not elegant red. These were loud, arrogant, impossible to ignore red heels, designed specifically to announce that the man wearing them had never once carried his own furniture, and kings absolutely adored them, especially Louis XIV of France. If you had entered the Palace of Versailles during the late 17th century, you would have found yourself trapped inside the most expensive peacock enclosure in European history. Everywhere you looked, noblemen floated through glittering halls wearing silk stockings, powdered wigs, lace sleeves, ribbons, perfume, jewels, and heels painted the color of fresh blood. Meanwhile, peasants outside were trying not to starve because the harvest failed again. Civilization has always enjoyed balance, but in royal courts, fashion was never just fashion, it was a weapon. The red heels worn by kings and nobles symbolized wealth, privilege, and status so extreme that practicality itself became embarrassing. The shoes were difficult to walk in. They slipped on polished floors. They sank into mud outdoors. They were objectively terrible for anyone expected to perform useful labor. which was exactly the point. A nobleman was not supposed to look useful. If your shoes allowed comfortable movement, people might accidentally assume you had employment. The fashion itself originally came from Persian cavalry riders centuries earlier. Riding heels helped soldiers secure their feet inside stirrups while firing weapons from horseback. European aristocrats saw the style and immediately copied it, because rich people throughout history have treated foreign trends the way modern influencers treat overpriced coffee shops. But by the time heels reached European courts, the military practicality had mostly disappeared. Now they existed purely to impress other rich people, and nobody understood this game better than Louis XIV. The French king transformed fashion into a form of political control. At Versailles, appearance became survival. Nobles competed endlessly over clothing, hairstyles, fabrics, jewelry, and of course, heels. Louis even restricted certain red heels to members of his court, turning footwear into an elite status symbol. Imagine being denied access to coloured shoes by royal decree. History truly is magnificent. Every detail at Versailles served one purpose: reminding everyone who held power. While nobles obsessed over silk socks and shoe ribbons, Louis controlled the kingdom itself. Courtiers spent fortunes trying to appear fashionable enough to remain close to him. Some ruined their finances entirely just to participate in palace life, and through endless marble halls, beneath chandeliers and painted ceilings, hundreds of red heels clicked across the floors every day, a constant sound of vanity echoing through one of the richest courts in Europe. Right before the French monarchy eventually exploded into revolution, but for now the heels remained spotless. At Versailles, getting dressed was essentially a competitive military campaign, except instead of cannons and cavalry, the weapons were silk stockings, diamonds, wigs taller than household furniture, and red heels polished so brightly they could probably signal ships from the coast. Every morning, hundreds of nobles crowded into the palace trying desperately to impress Louis XIV. Not through intelligence, bravery, or competence, of course. That would have been exhausting. No, they competed through appearance, through posture, through fashion, through who could stand nearest to the king while looking the most financially irresponsible, and Louis encouraged all of it, because the king understood something brilliant. Distracted nobles were harmless nobles. Before Versailles, French aristocrats had spent generations plotting rebellions, building regional power, and occasionally trying to overthrow the monarchy. Very inconvenient behavior. But Louis found a solution. Instead of fighting them directly, he transformed them into full-time luxury addicts, trapped inside a golden palace. Suddenly dukes and princes spent their days obsessing over court etiquette instead of politics. Who could wear what colour? Who could sit near the king? Who was allowed certain fabrics? And most importantly, who had the right heels? Red heels became one of the clearest symbols of royal favour. Only nobles approved by Louis could wear specific styles of red heels at court. The shoes acted almost like a membership badge for the richest club in Europe, a club where entry requirements included owning 17 wigs and pretending to enjoy indoor fountains. And the nobles obeyed eagerly. Some spent absurd amounts of money on clothing just to survive socially at Versailles. A single outfit could cost more than what an ordinary family earned in years. Tailors, shoemakers, wig makers, and perfumers became essential to court life, because appearances had become politically important. You were not merely dressing yourself, you were performing status. The palace itself intensified this madness. Mirrors reflected candlelight across endless golden halls, while musicians played during dinners that lasted hours. Perfume filled the air so heavily it nearly functioned as a weather system. Everywhere, heels clicked sharply against polished marble floors in a constant rhythm of wealth and insecurity. And beneath all that elegance sat pure anxiety. Because fashion mistakes mattered. A noble who appeared outdated, poorly dressed, or unfashionable risked humiliation at court. Worse, they risked losing proximity to the king himself. At Versailles, attention from Louis meant power, money, and influence. So noblemen practiced walking gracefully in heels that made basic movement unnecessarily dangerous. Imagine twisting your ankle because the king thought red shoes looked impressive. Entire aristocratic careers balanced on footwear, and somehow, everyone involved believed this system represented the peak of civilization. For most of history, nobody thought heels were feminine. In fact, the exact opposite was true. Heels were originally associated with soldiers, horsemen, kings and aristocrats. People who desperately wanted everyone around them to know they possessed both money and authority. If anything, heels were aggressively masculine. They projected power, confidence, and the comforting knowledge that someone else was probably paying your taxes for you. The trend began centuries earlier with Persian cavalry riders. Their heeled shoes helped secure their feet inside stirrups during combat, especially while standing to fire arrows from horseback. Practical, useful, deadly. Then European diplomats visited Persia in the early 17th century and immediately became fascinated, not by the military tactics, by the shoes, because European aristocrats have always possessed an extraordinary ability to misunderstand foreign cultures in the most expensive way possible. Soon, wealthy men across Europe began copying Persian riding fashion. Heels spread through royal courts, first among noblemen who wanted to appear worldly and sophisticated, and once kings started wearing them, everyone else followed automatically. That was how fashion worked in royal Europe. One powerful man wore something strange, and suddenly half the continent limped around, pretending it made sense. The higher the heel, the more elite you appeared. Tall heels altered posture, forcing noblemen to stand with their chest forward and back straight. Combined with silk stockings that showed off their calves, the shoes created a dramatic silhouette meant to project elegance and superiority. Aristocrats became deeply obsessed with their legs during this period. Portraits from the 17th century often show kings posing proudly, with one leg extended, like they were auditioning for a ballet about taxation. Louis XIV especially adored this style. The French king was not particularly tall, so his heels added extra height while also reinforcing his royal image. He commissioned elaborate portraits showing himself in towering red heels, embroidered robes, and silk stockings, staring confidently into the distance as though he personally invented sunlight. And honestly, in Versailles, people probably applauded when he entered a room. But fashion trends are fragile little creatures. Over time, attitudes began shifting. During the 18th century, Enlightenment thinkers started valuing practicality, restraint, and reason. Men's fashion slowly became darker, simpler, and more restrained. Heels gradually disappeared from male clothing while remaining in women's fashion instead, which is ironic. For centuries, powerful European men wore makeup, wigs, lace, jewelry, perfume, silk stockings, and red high heels without anyone questioning their masculinity. Then suddenly society decided this was unacceptable. History changes very quickly sometimes, usually for reasons nobody fully understands. And somewhere in a dusty royal portrait gallery, Louis XIV still stands forever in his red heels, looking absolutely convinced he is the most intimidating man in Europe. One of the greatest achievements of European aristocracy was turning impracticality into a status symbol. The less useful your clothing appeared, the more powerful you seemed. Red heels were perfect for this system. After all, nobody wearing delicate silk stockings and bright red shoes was expected to shovel manure, repair fences, or sprint across muddy fields chasing escaped pigs. Those were activities for peasants. Nobles existed for far more important responsibilities, such as standing dramatically beside windows and discussing who had offended whom at dinner. Fashion became a visual language of wealth. Every detail mattered. High heels suggested you never performed physical labor. Pale skin proved you did not work outdoors. Soft hands demonstrated you had servants for everything unpleasant. Enormous wigs showed you possessed enough free time to spend 3 hours preparing your hair like a decorative hunting dog. The message was simple. I am rich enough to survive while contributing almost nothing practical. And honestly, the strategy worked remarkably well for centuries. At royal courts, appearance often mattered more than competence. A nobleman who looked elegant, fashionable, and refined could gain influence simply by fitting into court culture correctly. Meanwhile, a brilliant military commander who dressed poorly risked being ignored entirely. Human civilization occasionally makes very questionable hiring decisions. Versailles pushed this obsession to absurd extremes. Nobles wore embroidered coats covered in gold thread, lace cuffs delicate enough to surrender immediately during rain, and heels painted in expensive red dyes. Some shoes featured decorative buckles sparkling with jewels. Others were designed so narrowly that walking itself became a small public performance. And everyone pretended this was normal. Court etiquette made things even worse. Noblemen practiced precise movements when greeting royalty, bowing correctly while somehow balancing on polished heels across slippery marble floors. Entire reputations could suffer if someone stumbled during an important ceremony. Imagine destroying your political career because your shoe betrayed you near a staircase. Meanwhile, outside palace walls, ordinary people walked through mud wearing wooden clogs and praying winter would not kill their livestock. The contrast was extraordinary. In cities like Paris, wealthy aristocrats glided through salons discussing philosophy and opera, while servants carried candles behind them. Farmers only a few miles away struggled to afford bread during harsh seasons. Yet the aristocracy continued spending fortunes on fashion because appearances maintained social order, or at least they believed they did. The truth was simpler. Luxury reassured nobles that they belonged above everyone else. Every red heel, silk ribbon, and powdered wig reinforced the illusion that wealth and refinement made them fundamentally superior. Fashion became armor against reality itself. But reality has patience, and eventually, millions of poorer people began looking at these jeweled noblemen clacking around in red heels and thinking something extremely dangerous. Perhaps these people are ridiculous. Nobody in European history loved being looked at more than Louis XIV. This was a man who turned waking up in the morning into a public performance. At Versailles, even the king getting dressed became an official ceremony attended by nobles desperate for attention. Important aristocrats competed for the honor of handing Louis his shirt, shoes, or gloves, which sounds absurd today, but at the time represented genuine political opportunity. Imagine fighting another grown man for the privilege of helping someone put on socks. Monarchy truly reached extraordinary levels in France, and naturally, the red heels played a starring role. Louis understood fashion better than most rulers understood warfare. He realized appearances created power. If the king looked magnificent enough, untouchable enough, dazzling enough, then the monarchy itself appeared eternal. So he carefully crafted every detail of his image. Towering wigs, embroidered robes, jewels, silk stockings, and of course, the famous red heels. The heels did several jobs at once. First, they made him taller. Louis was not especially short, but he was deeply aware of image. High heels added height and forced a proud posture that made him appear commanding during court ceremonies and portraits. Standing beside nobles in elaborate red heels, the king looked less like an ordinary man, and more like a living theatre production about absolute authority. Second, the heels reinforced exclusivity. Louis restricted certain red-heeled shoes to favoured members of his court. If you saw someone wearing them at Versailles, you immediately understood they belonged close to royal power. Fashion became a controlled hierarchy. Even shoe colour required permission from the king, which honestly sounds exhausting. Third, and most importantly, the heels distracted the nobility. This was Louis's true genius. While aristocrats obsessed over clothing, etiquette, dancing, and appearances, they spent less time organising rebellions or building independent power in the provinces. Versailles became a beautiful golden trap, where nobles slowly transformed into decorative accessories orbiting around the king, and they loved it. They bankrupted themselves buying fashionable clothing just to survive socially at court. Families spent fortunes on wigs, silk, perfume, and shoes, because falling behind in fashion meant losing influence. Some nobles became so financially ruined by court life that they depended entirely on royal favour to survive, exactly as Louis intended. The palace itself amplified this madness daily. Mirrors reflected candlelight across endless halls, while musicians played during elaborate ceremonies. Red heels clicked constantly across marble floors, like tiny warning signals of aristocratic vanity. And at the centre stood Louis himself, dressed like the human embodiment of expensive confidence. The Sun King, a ruler so committed to appearances that he convinced an entire generation of noblemen to wear bright red high heels without hesitation. Honestly, that level of influence is almost impressive enough to justify the monarchy. Almost. At some point, people stopped seeing red heels as fashionable and started seeing them as insulting. This was not immediate. For decades, European nobles had strutted through palaces dressed like extremely confident wedding cakes, while ordinary people mostly tolerated it. Kings wore jewels worth entire villages. Aristocrats powdered their wigs with flour during periods when actual bread became difficult to afford. Everyone simply accepted this arrangement, because monarchy depended heavily on the idea that rich people were somehow closer to God. Then food prices rose, and suddenly the heels looked different. By the 18th century, France faced growing economic problems. Wars drained money. Taxes crushed ordinary people. Harvest failures created hunger across the countryside, while Versailles continued glowing like a giant golden chandelier visible from space. And inside that palace, nobles still competed over silk ribbons and shoe buckles. The contrast became impossible to ignore. To peasants and city workers struggling to survive, aristocratic fashion no longer looked elegant. It looked ridiculous. Worse, it looked cruel. Red heels, once symbols of royal prestige, now represented detachment from reality itself. Imagine trying to explain to a starving farmer that the kingdom absolutely needed another ballroom filled with men dressed like decorative parrots. Even some intellectuals began mocking court fashion openly. Enlightenment thinkers criticized excess, vanity, and inherited privilege. Writers and philosophers increasingly praised simplicity, practicality, and reason. Suddenly, the aristocracy's obsession with luxury appeared outdated rather than impressive. Fashion trends started shifting alongside politics. Men's clothing slowly became darker, plainer, and more restrained. Bright silks and towering heels faded from elite male fashion. Noblemen who once displayed wealth openly now tried appearing more serious and rational, as though Europe collectively woke up one morning embarrassed by the previous century. Unfortunately for the monarchy, this change arrived too late, because anger had already spread. By the time the French Revolution exploded in 1789, aristocratic fashion had become symbolic of everything ordinary people hated about the old system. Extravagant wigs, jewels, perfumes, and red heels represented privilege built upon inequality. And revolutionary crowds were not particularly interested in preserving luxury footwear traditions. Many nobles fled France entirely. Others lost titles, estates, or heads. Versailles itself transformed from the centre of royal glamour into a reminder of excess gone catastrophically wrong. The red heels disappeared with them. Not overnight, of course. Fashion always changes slowly. But after the revolution, openly dressing like an ornamental peacock funded by peasant taxes became politically dangerous. Strange how quickly trends die when people start building guillotines nearby. And somewhere beneath all the chaos sat an uncomfortable truth. The heels had never really been about beauty. They were about power, which meant once the power vanished, the fashion followed it directly into history's closet. Once aristocratic men abandoned high heels, women inherited them completely. Fashion has always worked this way. One group suddenly decides something is embarrassing, and another group immediately gets stuck explaining it for the next 300 years. By the late 18th century, European men had begun dressing more plainly. Dark coats replaced bright silks. Simpler shoes replaced ornate heels. Masculinity itself was being redesigned around ideas of seriousness, restraint, and practicality, at least publicly. Privately, rich men still enjoyed ridiculous luxury. They simply preferred pretending otherwise now. Women's fashion, however, moved in the opposite direction. As men simplified their appearance, women became the primary carriers of decorative fashion. Heels survived because they still symbolized elegance, wealth, and status. But now society increasingly associated those qualities with femininity instead of aristocratic masculinity, which was historically very strange. For generations, kings and noblemen had worn heels proudly without anyone questioning it. Then suddenly, the exact same shoes became women's fashion, as though Europe collectively suffered a memory problem. The transformation happened gradually. Women's heels became narrower, taller, and less practical than the old riding heels worn by aristocratic men. Designers emphasized posture and movement. High heels altered the shape of the body, changing how women walked and stood. Fashion magazines and portrait artists celebrated these effects endlessly, because humanity apparently never tires of inventing uncomfortable ways to impress strangers. Meanwhile, practical shoes remained associated with work, and work naturally remained unfashionable. By the 19th century, heels had become firmly tied to femininity, beauty, and social status. Wealthy women wore delicate heels to balls, salons, theatres, and royal gatherings, while servants and labourers continued wearing durable flat shoes designed for surviving actual reality. The class symbolism never disappeared. It simply changed audience. A woman wearing expensive heels demonstrated she belonged to a world where physical labor was unnecessary. Just like noblemen centuries earlier, the message remained, I am important enough that discomfort itself becomes fashionable. And honestly, the shoes were uncomfortable. Victorian doctors frequently complained about tight corsets and dangerous footwear damaging women's health. But fashion rarely listens to doctors. If it did, half of human history would have dressed like tired fishermen. The irony is that most people today have no idea heels were originally masculine aristocratic fashion. Modern culture treats the idea of kings wearing red heels as bizarre, almost comedic. But to Louis XIV, the shoes symbolized authority, prestige, and royal magnificence, which means somewhere in history, a French king wearing scarlet high heels would probably stare at modern sneakers with complete horror, and frankly, he might have a point. By the 19th century, Europe's kings no longer dressed like jeweled theatre props. The age of red heels, towering wigs, silk stockings, and lace-covered noblemen had faded into memory. Monarchs still loved luxury, of course. Human beings do not suddenly become humble because history changes centuries. But rulers now wanted to appear disciplined, military, and serious, not like decorative parrots wandering through marble hallways. The French Revolution had terrified Europe's aristocracy permanently. Watching a monarchy collapse beneath public anger tends to create strong emotional memories. Nobles across the continent suddenly realized something horrifying. Ordinary people had eyes, and those eyes had been staring at powdered wigs and red heels for generations, thinking, these people look ridiculous. So royal fashion adapted. Kings began wearing military uniforms more often instead of extravagant court clothing. Dark coats replaced embroidered silks. Boots replaced delicate heels. Simplicity itself became fashionable among powerful men because it projected control, discipline, and rationality, at least on the surface. Underneath, the obsession with status remained exactly the same. The rich simply changed costumes. Instead of competing over heels and lace, elite men now competed through tailored suits, expensive fabrics, military decorations, watches, and private clubs. Vanity survived perfectly. It merely learned to disguise itself as seriousness. A very European solution? Portraits from earlier centuries suddenly looked absurd to newer generations. 18th century kings posed with curled wigs, silk ribbons, and bright red heels extended proudly toward the viewer. 19th century rulers looked at those paintings the way modern people look at old family photos featuring questionable hairstyles and emotional confidence, with deep discomfort. And yet, despite changing fashions, royal courts never fully abandoned spectacle. Ceremonies remained elaborate, crowns still glittered, thrones still existed for no practical reason whatsoever. Even as Europe industrialized and modernized, monarchies clung tightly to ritual, because ritual created mystique, and mystique helped justify power. That was always the real purpose behind the heels. Not beauty, not comfort, not even fashion itself. The red heels existed to separate rulers from ordinary humanity. Every uncomfortable step across polished palace floors reminded everyone watching that kings belonged to a different world entirely. A world of privilege so extreme that practicality became irrelevant. But history slowly destroyed that illusion. Revolutions spread. Democracies expanded. Aristocratic power weakened. The old courts lost much of their authority, and with it vanished the need for men to dress like living chandeliers. Still, the portraits survived. Even today, museums across Europe display paintings of kings standing proudly in silk stockings and red heels worth more than a peasant earned in years. And honestly, the confidence is remarkable. Imagine ruling an empire while dressed like the final boss of luxury curtains. Today, the red heels survive mostly in museums, behind glass cases under soft lighting, preserved like strange little artifacts from a civilization that briefly lost its mind in extremely expensive ways. Tourists stare at them and laugh. The shoes look tiny, fragile, decorative, almost theatrical. Modern audiences struggle to imagine powerful kings wearing them seriously because history tends to flatten the past into stereotypes. We imagine rulers as grim men in armor or dark uniforms, not glittering aristocrats balancing carefully across palace floors in scarlet heels. But the shoes mattered. They represented an entire world, a world where status determined everything. where kings believed power should look magnificent, where noblemen spent fortunes on fashion because appearing wealthy was sometimes more important than actually being competent, and where red heels quietly told everyone around you, "I belong above ordinary people." That message lasted for centuries. Even after the heels disappeared from men's fashion, their meaning survived. Modern luxury brands still sell status through clothing. Celebrities still wear impractical outfits to display wealth. Politicians still carefully manage appearances because image influences authority. Human beings remain deeply vulnerable to spectacle. We simply replaced Versailles with social media. Honestly, Louis XIV would have adapted frighteningly well to Instagram. The most fascinating part is how quickly society rewrites fashion history. Today, high heels are treated almost entirely as women's fashion, while many people would consider them unmanly on men. Yet for generations, Europe's most powerful kings, generals, and aristocrats wore heels proudly without hesitation. Masculinity changed, fashion changed, power changed, but confidence never did, because the men wearing those heels never doubted themselves for a second. They walked through golden halls surrounded by servants, music, perfume, chandeliers, and terrified nobles, completely convinced history revolved around them personally. And for a while it actually did. Then came revolutions, economic collapse, modern politics, industrial society, the slow death of aristocratic Europe. The red heels faded away alongside the old royal courts that created them. What once symbolized ultimate authority eventually became costume material for period dramas and museum exhibits. But the portraits remain. Louis XIV still stands frozen forever in silk stockings and brilliant red heels, staring confidently from gilded frames with the expression of a man absolutely certain future generations will admire him. Instead, future generations mostly ask why Europe's most powerful men dressed like fashionable vampires attending a wedding, which honestly feels a little unfair, because beneath all the vanity, the heels reveal something timeless about human civilization. People will always use fashion to display power. Some eras simply do it with more lace. Genghis Khan did not raise his daughters in marble palaces surrounded by servants carrying grapes and gossip. He raised them on the Mongol steppe, which was essentially an endless ocean of grass where winter tried to kill you personally. The Mongol world was vast, cold, and brutally practical. The winds never seemed to stop. Summers baked the plains beneath open skies, while winters froze rivers solid and turned exposed fingers black with frost. Villages barely existed. Cities were distant rumours. Most Mongols lived in great circular felt tents called gurs that could be packed onto wagons and moved across the steppe whenever the herds needed fresh grazing land. Everything moved constantly. People, animals, entire societies. And from the moment Genghis Khan's daughters were born, they were expected to survive inside this harsh world without complaint. There was no separate princess education on the Mongol steppe, no embroidery lessons beside castle windows, no delicate court manners taught by powdered tutors. A daughter of Genghis Khan learned the same brutal realities as everyone else. Ride well, endure hardship, obey quickly, and never become weak enough to slow the group down. Because on the steppe, weakness killed people. Mongol girls learned horseback riding almost as soon as they could walk steadily. Children practically grew up in saddles. European visitors later described Mongols as looking fused to their horses, which honestly was not far from reality. Genghis Khan's daughters spent their childhood racing across open plains, herding sheep and horses, hunting small animals, and enduring weather conditions that would cause most European nobles to immediately collapse into dramatic poetry. A horse was not a luxury, it was survival itself. The daughters of Genghis also learned archery, endurance, and camp management from an early age. Mongol women carried enormous responsibility within society. While men rode off to raid or wage war, women controlled the daily functioning of camps. They managed supplies, repaired clothing, cared for livestock, prepared food, traded goods, raised children, and organized migrations across hundreds of miles of open land. Without capable women, Mongol society simply stopped functioning, and Genghis Khan understood this better than most rulers of his era. He had grown up in hardship himself. Before becoming conqueror of the largest land empire in history, He spent years surviving betrayal, hunger, tribal warfare, and near starvation. So when he raised his daughters, he did not shelter them from difficulty. He prepared them for it because out on the steppe, surrounded by freezing winds and rival tribes, survival belonged to the people who adapted fastest. And the daughters of Genghis Khan were raised to adapt to absolutely everything. Childhood on the Mongol steppe was not gentle, especially if your father planned to conquer half the known world. The daughters of Genghis Khan grew up inside a society where survival skills mattered more than luxury, and where children were expected to become useful very quickly. Nobody cared if you were tired. The herds still needed moving. The horses still needed tending. The freezing wind still tore across the plains like it had a personal grudge against humanity. And somewhere nearby, a goat was probably escaping again. From an early age, Mongol girls learned how to ride for hours without rest. They practiced controlling horses across rough terrain while carrying supplies, weapons, or younger siblings. Riding was not treated as some noble pastime the way European aristocrats viewed hunting. It was daily life. Fall off your horse too often, and you risked slowing down an entire migration. The steppe had little patience for incompetence. The daughters of Genghis also learned how to survive harsh winters, locate water, manage livestock, and navigate enormous stretches of open land where landmarks barely existed. Mongols developed extraordinary memory for terrain and direction, because getting lost out there was an excellent way to become frozen decorative scenery for wolves. And wolves were everywhere. The girls grew up hearing them at night beyond the camps while fires crackled inside the jurs. They learned quickly that fear itself was useless. Storms came suddenly. Livestock died unexpectedly. Rival tribes raided without warning. The Mongol world rewarded calmness under pressure because panic solved absolutely nothing. Genghis Khan respected this mentality deeply. Unlike many rulers of the medieval world, he did not treat daughters as politically unimportant. Mongol women often held real authority within society, especially among elite families. Women managed camps, supervised trade, controlled supplies, and occasionally ruled territories, while male relatives fought distant wars. Competence mattered more than gender, a shockingly modern concept compared to many kingdoms at the time, where noble women were often treated like decorative furniture with marriage contracts attached. The daughters of Genghis learned politics alongside survival. Around campfires, they listened to discussions about alliances, betrayals, raids, and tribal loyalty. They watched envoys arrive from distant clans carrying gifts, threats, or marriage proposals. They learned early that leadership required strategy as much as strength, and strength itself came in many forms. Some daughters became skilled riders and administrators. Others developed sharp political instincts. But all of them grew up understanding one brutal truth about Mongol life. Nothing was guaranteed. Not food, not safety, not power. Out on the endless steppe, survival belonged to the people who stayed adaptable, observant, and ruthless when necessary. And Genghis Khan intended his daughters to become exactly that. Genghis Khan did not marry off his daughters simply to create peaceful family alliances. He used them to build an empire. A very large difference. In much of medieval Europe, royal daughters were often traded into marriages, where their primary political duty involved producing heirs and quietly surviving terrible castles with damp walls and disappointing husbands. Mongol politics worked differently. When Genghis Khan arranged marriages for his daughters, he frequently placed them into positions of genuine authority, and then he made their husbands leave. This was an incredible strategy, honestly. Genghis would marry a daughter to the ruler of an allied tribe or kingdom. Then, shortly afterward, he would send the new husband away on military campaigns alongside the Mongol armies. Many of these men died in battle, very unfortunate for them personally. But while the husbands fought, the daughters ruled. The women of Genghis Khan's family often governed territories stretching across important trade routes and frontier regions of the empire. Some controlled cities, taxation systems, caravan networks, and military logistics. Others supervised vast lands connecting Mongolia to Central Asia. The daughters became critical political anchors holding the empire together, while Mongol armies expanded outward. And unlike many rulers of the era, Genghis trusted them deeply. One daughter, Alakai Beki, ruled territories in northern China and helped secure dangerous border regions. Another daughter, Altalun, reportedly became respected for her intelligence and leadership. Mongol records and later Persian accounts repeatedly describe Genghis Khan relying heavily on the abilities of his daughters and female relatives, which makes sense. He had raised them on the steppe to survive chaos from childhood. Now he expected them to manage it politically. Marriage itself became less about romance and more about strategic control. By placing daughters into powerful allied families, Genghis extended Mongol influence without needing constant military occupation. His daughters effectively acted as governors, diplomats, and stabilizers across enormous regions of the empire. Meanwhile, their husbands were usually far away fighting wars somewhere unpleasant. The arrangement also strengthened loyalty. Allied tribes connected themselves directly to the bloodline of Genghis Khan, which carried enormous prestige and intimidation. Betraying the Mongol Empire suddenly meant betraying your wife's terrifyingly successful family. Not ideal for domestic harmony. What is remarkable is how much real authority these women exercised. In many medieval societies, female political power remained unofficial or heavily restricted. Among the Mongol elite, however, women could hold administrative control openly, especially when they proved capable. And capability mattered more than tradition to Genghis Khan. The empire expanded too quickly and violently to waste talent. So while much of the medieval world underestimated women politically, the daughters of Genghis Khan governed trade routes, influenced diplomacy, and helped maintain one of the largest empires in human history, all while riding horses across windswept plains, which honestly sounds far more productive than most royal courts in Europe at the time. As the Mongol Empire expanded, the daughters of Genghis Khan found themselves ruling some of the most important territories on Earth. Not villages, not tiny estates, entire trade regions connected to the Silk Road itself, which meant these women controlled wealth flowing between China, Central Asia, Persia, and beyond. Silk, horses, spices, silver, weapons, furs, precious stones. Everything moved through Mongol territory now. Caravans crossed deserts and mountains beneath the protection of the empire, carrying enough riches to make European kings emotionally unstable. And many of those routes were supervised by Genghis Khan's daughters. This was not symbolic power. It was real administration. The Mongol Empire depended heavily on movement and communication. Armies traveled constantly. Messengers crossed enormous distances. Trade had to continue flowing because conquest alone did not sustain an empire forever. Someone needed to organize supplies, taxes, local alliances, security, and political stability. The daughters helped do exactly that. Alakai Beki became especially important after marrying into the Ongut tribe, which guarded key frontier territories near northern China. She reportedly played a major role in maintaining loyalty among local rulers, while securing strategic trade routes for the Mongols. Persian historians later described her as intelligent, capable, and politically effective, which was fortunate, because frontier politics during Mongol expansion was essentially one long emergency meeting, with occasional massacres. Other daughters and female relatives also exercised authority across different regions. Mongol noblewomen supervised courts, handled diplomatic negotiations, and managed enormous estates, while male relatives campaigned abroad. In some cases, women even controlled military resources and coordinated defenses against rebellions or rival tribes. And they did all this while living in a culture built around mobility. That part often surprises people. The Mongols did not construct giant stone capitals at first like European monarchies. Power moved with the camps. Elite women often travelled with enormous mobile courts carried across the steppe by wagons, servants, guards, and herds of animals stretching across the horizon. Imagine governing international trade while living inside a moving tent city. Honestly, more efficient than some modern bureaucracies. Foreign visitors frequently noticed how much authority Mongol women possessed compared to women in many other medieval societies. European travellers especially seemed slightly shocked that Mongol women rode horses confidently, spoke openly in political settings, and exercised visible control over economic affairs. Meanwhile, back in Europe, some queens still required male permission to sign documents. The daughters of Genghis Khan represented something the empire valued deeply: competence. If someone could govern territory effectively, maintain loyalty, and protect trade routes, the Mongols cared far less about whether that person was male or female. Results mattered. And on the cold steppe, Results were often the only thing standing between empire and disaster. The daughters of Genghis Khan were not raised to hide behind walls, while men handled warfare. They grew up beside it. War surrounded the Mongol world constantly. Tribal rivalries, raids, revenge killings, shifting alliances. The steppe was rarely peaceful for long. Children heard stories of ambushes and battles around campfires the way other societies discussed weather. Horses were always ready. Weapons stayed close. And every family understood that survival sometimes depended on moving quickly and fighting harder than the people attacking you. The daughters of Genghis learned this early. They rode across enormous distances alongside migrating camps and military movements, watching the machinery of conquest unfold in real time. Mongol warfare relied on speed, discipline, and endurance more than massive castles or heavily armored knights. Armies could travel astonishing distances in days, living off herds and carrying minimal supplies, which meant everyone needed toughness, including elite women. Mongol girls learned archery from horseback, hunting skills, and how to remain calm during chaos. Even if they did not fight directly in major battles, they understood military life intimately because warfare shaped the entire empire around them. And honestly, there was not much separation between civilian life and military life anyway. A Mongol camp could transform into a moving war machine very quickly. Women also played critical logistical roles during campaigns. They managed supplies, maintained camps, cared for animals, prepared food, repaired clothing and equipment, and organized migrations behind advancing armies. An empire crossing Asia on horseback required staggering coordination, and much of that daily organization depended on women. Without them, Mongol campaigns collapsed into starving confusion remarkably fast. The daughters of Genghis watched their father build military loyalty carefully. Merit mattered deeply within the Mongol system. Brave commanders could rise through the ranks regardless of noble birth, while cowards lost respect quickly. Genghis valued discipline above almost everything else. Orders had to be obeyed immediately because hesitation during steppe warfare usually ended with arrows in your chest. A very motivating management style. The girls also witnessed the emotional cost of conquest. Men left for campaigns and never returned. Rival tribes disappeared entirely after resisting Mongol rule. Camps filled with wounded soldiers, captured animals, and stories of brutal victories across distant lands. The empire grew larger every year, but expansion carried enormous violence behind it. Genghis Khan did not hide these realities from his daughters. He wanted them to understand power completely. Not just ceremony or titles, but the harsh machinery required to maintain authority across enormous territories. And on the steppe, authority rested heavily on military strength. The daughters learned that survival depended on preparation, discipline, and adaptability. Horses had to remain ready. Supplies had to stay organized. Weak leadership invited disaster, because the Mongol Empire moved fast, and anything too fragile to keep pace was eventually left behind. As the empire expanded across Asia, the daughters of Genghis Khan carried another responsibility just as important as warfare or politics. They became the mothers of future rulers, and in Mongol society, motherhood was not treated as some quiet background role hidden behind palace curtains. The women of Genghis Khan's family shaped dynasties directly. They raised sons who would inherit armies, govern territories, negotiate alliances, and occasionally start catastrophic civil wars like emotionally unstable weather systems. Very productive family environment overall. The daughters understood from childhood that bloodlines mattered enormously inside the empire. Loyalty to the descendants of Genghis Khan became one of the central pillars holding the Mongol world together. A ruler connected to the great conqueror's family possessed legitimacy that no ordinary tribal chief could easily challenge, which meant the women carrying that bloodline held tremendous influence. Mongol mothers supervised the education of elite children carefully. Boys learned riding, archery, hunting, and military discipline almost immediately. They were taught endurance before comfort, obedience before pride. A future Mongol ruler needed toughness, because weakness on the steppe attracted rivals faster than spilled meat attracted wolves. The daughters of Genghis passed down the survival mentality they had inherited themselves. Children grew up inside moving camps filled with soldiers, envoys, merchants, and political tension. They listened to discussions about alliances and betrayals while watching maps spread across carpets inside great tents. They learned quickly that empire required constant vigilance and constant movement. Mothers also taught practical administration. Mongol elite women frequently managed households and camps, while men campaigned abroad. So daughters and sons alike observed women exercising real authority from childhood. Unlike many medieval courts where noblewomen were pushed into ceremonial roles, Mongol society expected capable women to solve problems directly. If supplies failed, people starved. If horses weakened, armies slowed. If alliances collapsed, wars followed. There was little room for ornamental leadership. The daughters of Genghis also carried cultural traditions across vast distances as the empire spread. Through marriage alliances and mobile courts, they helped maintain Mongol identity while ruling regions filled with different languages, religions, and customs. One generation earlier, the Mongols had been scattered tribes fighting for survival. Now their descendants ruled enormous territories stretching across continents, an extraordinary transformation within a single lifetime. But raising children inside the Mongol Empire came with constant uncertainty. Succession struggles haunted elite families. Brothers competed for power. Rival factions formed around different branches of the royal bloodline. A child born into the family of Genghis Khan inherited prestige, wealth, and danger simultaneously. The daughters understood this perfectly. They had been raised on the steppe by a man who conquered through adaptability, discipline, and ruthless political awareness. Now they raised the next generation the same way. Because in the Mongol world, survival was never guaranteed. Not even for the children of empire. When people think about the Mongol Empire, they usually imagine cavalry charging across open plains, cities burning, and Genghis Khan glaring at maps while somebody nearby experiences profound regret. What they rarely imagine are his daughters quietly holding the empire together behind the scenes. But they did. As Mongol armies pushed deeper into Asia and beyond, the empire became too enormous for one man to control directly. Territories stretched across deserts, mountains, forests, and trade cities, filled with people who spoke dozens of different languages. Messages took weeks or months to travel. Governors needed authority, alliances needed maintenance, taxes needed collecting, and somebody had to stop everything from collapsing into chaos. Very often that somebody was one of Genghis Khan's daughters. The women of the royal family managed frontier regions, supervised trade routes, negotiated with local rulers, and stabilized newly conquered territories, while Mongol commanders remained away at war. In many ways, they acted as the connective tissue of the empire itself. Without capable administration, conquest meant nothing. The Mongols understood this clearly. Alakai Beki became especially influential after marrying into the Ongoud people near northern China. She reportedly helped secure key border territories and maintained loyalty among local tribes during periods of rapid expansion. Other daughters ruled regions connected to the Silk Road, where controlling trade meant controlling wealth, and the wealth moving through Mongol territory was staggering. Caravans carried silk, gold, silver, spices, horses, furs, weapons, and precious stones across thousands of miles. The Mongol Empire eventually created one of the largest trade networks in medieval history, protected by military patrols and diplomatic agreements stretching across continents. Meanwhile, somewhere inside a moving Mongol camp, one of Genghis Khan's daughters was probably organizing supply inventories while men with swords dramatically discussed glory. History often works this way. The loudest people receive the legends. The organized people keep civilization functioning. The daughters also became political mediators inside the royal family itself. Succession disputes constantly threatened Mongol unity after Genghis grew older. Rival branches of the family competed for influence, territory, and military support. Elite women often acted as negotiators between powerful factions because they possessed connections across multiple tribal alliances through marriage and bloodline, which required extraordinary political skill. One wrong decision inside the Mongol royal family could trigger civil war across half a continent, and eventually it did. But during the early decades of expansion, the daughters of Genghis Khan helped maintain stability across a rapidly growing empire, held together by loyalty, fear, trade, and horses traveling at terrifying speed across the steppe. Not bad for women. Many medieval societies would have dismissed entirely. Then again, Most medieval societies never produced an empire large enough to make maps nervous. The daughters of Genghis Khan learned something early that many kings never understood. Power was temporary. On the Mongol steppe, nothing stayed still long enough to trust completely. Herds moved constantly. Camps migrated with the seasons. Alliances shifted. Weather changed without warning. One winter storm could destroy livestock. One betrayal could erase an entire tribe from history. The steppe trained people to adapt or disappear, and the daughters of Genghis carried that mentality into politics. Unlike rulers raised inside permanent stone palaces, Mongol elites understood movement. Their courts travelled, their armies travelled, even their homes moved across the grasslands on giant wagons pulled by oxen and camels. Power itself felt mobile, flexible, almost alive. This shaped how the daughters governed. They valued loyalty, speed, and practical decision-making over ceremony. A ruler who could not respond quickly to crises lost authority fast. There was little patience for weakness or indecision when entire regions depended on stable trade routes and military protection. And honestly, the Mongol world rarely allowed emotional overthinking anyway. If a blizzard was approaching, nobody gathered for philosophical debate beside candles. You moved the animals immediately or froze to death. The daughters also understood leadership through observation. They had watched Genghis Khan rise from near starvation and tribal exile to ruler of the largest land empire in human history. They saw firsthand how discipline, organization, and ruthless strategy transformed scattered nomadic tribes into an unstoppable force. But they also witnessed the fragility beneath that success. The empire depended heavily on personal loyalty to the royal family. Conquered peoples obeyed partly out of fear, partly because Mongol rule often protected trade and stability better than endless regional wars had before. But underneath it all remained constant tension. Too many ambitious generals, too many rival heirs, too much land. The daughters learned to navigate this dangerous environment carefully. They built alliances through marriage, diplomacy, and trade while balancing relationships between tribal leaders, military commanders, and royal relatives. Every political decision carried risks because the empire expanded faster than anyone could fully control. And after Genghis Khan died, those risks became far more dangerous. The unity holding the empire together slowly weakened as different branches of the family competed for dominance. Brothers argued, grandsons fought wars against each other, regional rulers gained independence. The giant empire eventually fractured into separate khanates spread across Asia and Eastern Europe. But during its rise, the daughters of Genghis Khan helped maintain order inside one of the most extraordinary political systems in medieval history. Not through luxury, not through courtly charm, but through endurance learned on the cold Mongol steppe, a place where survival came first, weakness invited disaster, and children grew up understanding that power belonged only to those strong enough to hold on to it. When Genghis Khan died in 1227, he left behind the largest land empire the world had ever seen, but he also left behind daughters capable of helping hold it together. That part often gets forgotten. History tends to focus on the men charging into battle, while quietly ignoring the people managing everything afterward. Chroniclers loved describing sieges, massacres, and conquering armies. Much less attention went toward the women organizing trade, stabilizing alliances, governing territories, and preventing the empire from collapsing every other Tuesday. Which is unfortunate, because the daughters of Genghis Khan were extraordinary political figures. For decades after their father's death, Mongol royal women continued exercising major influence across Asia. They supervised trade networks, advised rulers, managed courts, and protected the authority of the royal bloodline during increasingly dangerous succession struggles. And those struggles became brutal. As the empire expanded further, different branches of Genghis Khan's descendants fought constantly over power. Rival Khans competed for territory and loyalty, while generals carved out influence across distant regions. The unity created by Genghis slowly fractured beneath ambition and geography. Very common empire problem. Too much land, too many relatives, not enough trust. Yet throughout this chaos, Mongol women often remained central to diplomacy and governance. Some acted as regents for young heirs, others negotiated between rival factions, or protected political stability during transitions of power. Elite women of the Mongol world frequently possessed authority that surprised foreign observers, especially Europeans accustomed to more restrictive court systems. Persian and Chinese chroniclers occasionally described these women with a mixture of admiration and confusion, because they were not passive royal figures. They rode horses, directed political decisions, controlled wealth, and occasionally intimidated powerful men who underestimated them. The legacy of Genghis Khan's daughters also survived culturally. Their lives reflected the values of the steppe itself: endurance, adaptability, mobility, and practical leadership. They were raised in harsh conditions that demanded competence from everyone, regardless of gender. Survival mattered more than appearances. A radical concept compared to certain medieval courts where noblemen spent entire afternoons arguing about lace sleeves. Even centuries later, Mongol royal women remained symbols of strength within regional history and folklore. Though many of their names faded from popular memory outside Central Asia, their influence shaped the administration and survival of one of history's greatest empires. And honestly, their achievements become even more impressive when you remember the environment they came from.